Póntenlos. Adios.
What is up, everybody? RandomRandomMan here, bringing you my review for Sicario, Day of the Soldado. Now, the plot basically follows the drug war at the US-Mexico border as it has escalated to the point where the cartels have begun smuggling terrorists, forcing the US government to team up with hitman Alejandro Gillick, played by Benicio del Toro. Going into this movie, I had moderate expectations, mainly because I was a bit surprised that a movie like 2015's Sicario, which is Spanish for Hitman, even got a sequel greenlit for it. Also, Soldado is Spanish for soldier, in case you didn't know. Now, to give you my brief thoughts on that first film, I think Sicario is a stellar movie. It's one of my favorite films of 2015, actually, and was my introduction to director Denis Villeneuve, who has directed other impressive work such as 2013's Prisoners and some amazing sci-fi works such as 2016's Arrival and 2017's Blade Runner 2049. All these movies became my favorite films of their respective years. Yet, when it came to the sequel to Sicario, Denis Villeneuve was announced to have not returned to direct. In fact, the only returning players to this sequel include the likes of stars Benicio del Toro, Josh Brolin, and writer Taylor Sheridan. Now, Taylor Sheridan has done other work. He's written the script for Hell or High Water, a phenomenal movie from 2016, one of my favorites of that year as well. He got an Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay for writing that film, and he also wrote and directed last year's Wind River, a fantastic movie, and also another one of my favorite movies of 2017. So, with what I saw going into this Sicario sequel, it looked interesting, and I was quite curious to see what would justify a sequel for that film to exist. Starting out with the cast and their performances, we have, once again, Benicio del Toro return to the role of Alejandro Gillick in this sequel, and he retains the same tremendous bravado of him being both reserved in his demeanor and how he carries out his deeds, but also the total badassery that he exudes just from his screen presence. He has a lot more to do here, and the depth that is brought with his performance in how his character is developed throughout the film does make for him to be compelling as he was in the first film, except we get a lot more of him this time around. Also returning is Josh Brolin in the role of Matt Graver. He gets a lot more to do in this sequel, and he has a bit of a no-nonsense attitude as well, especially towards the beginning. Also returning from the first film is Jeffrey Donovan, whose character is a part of the team that Del Toro and Brolin are a part of. So it was cool to see another person from the original film come back, even if it was for some minor instances. But some new players here include the likes of Isabella Moner as the daughter of this head honcho of a cartel in Mexico. Now, I've previously known her as the girl from Transformers: The Last Night, a movie I did not see, but seeing her in the trailers leading up to that film, she looked quite annoying, and I heard she actually was in that film. But in this role, in this sequel, she actually was quite impressive, giving some reserved nature to her as well. I mean, she screams and cries a lot in the movie, but her character does have some intrigue to her, to where her role actually adds on to a bit of the commentary that the movie does present. Also introduced is Manuel Garcia Rulfo as the head of a migrant smuggling group. He's very good here, as is Matthew Modine as the Secretary of the State, and Catherine Keener as another member of the CIA, I believe. Now, with those last two actors, Modine and Keener, they're mainly bit parts, but I did like the screen time that they did have, as I feel they're two strong actors. Basically, everyone in this film, but especially especially Del Toro, Brolin, and Moner give terrific performances. The writing here, once again done by Taylor Sheridan, brings up something very interesting in the way this movie begins. In fact, it is interesting because it begins with a bang, literally, as what I've mentioned with the plot beforehand involves terrorists being smuggled into Mexico and then across the US-Mexico border, causing some havoc and a lot of terror for what they ensue. This gets added onto when Brolin's character is introduced into the story, and then when Del Toro's character is put into the plot. Him and Brolin's character's main objective is to start a war between two Mexican drug cartels by kidnapping the daughter of one of the cartel's leaders. That part of the narrative actually gets the movie going in a significant manner, but it's also a part of a problem I do have with how the story pans out, and it's with how it's written to where it gets progressively unfocused as the movie goes on. The movie begins, like I've said, involving how the US government is forced to work with Del Toro's character to try and stop terrorists from going over the US-Mexico border, but then it switches over into Moner's character getting kidnapped, and then the movie keeps going and trying to bring in some more ideas until it changes again when the movie hits its third act. Now, what I appreciate with what this movie tries to do is bring in a lot of bigger themes with how this movie is even set in the atmosphere that it is presented with, and how there's quite a bit of commentary that is shockingly timely to right now, as if you've been paying attention to recent current events, the US-Mexico border has been talked about a lot in the news, especially involving children being separated from their families. Moner's character has a huge part to play with how the movie does pan out after her introduction, and then halfway through, if you've seen the trailers and marketing to this movie, then you know that Del Toro's character makes a decision that radically changes the plot, and then it keeps going into some more unfocused territory, which I feel is a shame because, again, a lot more concepts and ideas are brought into the fray to try and bring some more commentary and significance to what this movie is trying to tell. And I feel that's one thing this movie actually has over the original. But at the same time, again, it doesn't pan out as cleanly as the first film. And that is one major part of why I prefer the first movie over this second film. Yet, I also feel it's quite a bit of an unfair comparison to the first movie in that some of the behind-the-scenes crew do not return for this sequel. Again, we have a different director here, Stefano Salima. We also have a different director of photography with Roger Deakins not returning from the first film. And you can tell that this movie is made with a different behind-the-scenes crew. Yet, at the same time, though, the way this movie is directed, shot, and all around set up, it is well done. I think the way this movie looks does bring up a lot of reminiscent shots from the first film, even if they aren't as masterfully framed from the likes of Roger Deakins. And the directing here, like in the way of the action, does bring for some engaging moments. This film also doesn't have the same film composer doing the original score for it. The first film's music was done by Johan Johansson, which I thought added on to how really chilling the first film felt. Sadly, Johansson actually passed away earlier this year, back in February, so may he rest in peace. This movie is actually dedicated in his memory, which I thought was so nice of the movie to be dedicated in his honor. Even the reprise of the theme from the first film, known as The Beast, is played towards the end of this film, which I thought was welcome to hear. And as for the music for this film, it sounds competent. It does have some shades of what the first film did, although it never blared to such intense extent. One thing that this movie does have in common with the first film, aside from its terrific performances, is how it does play up its grim tensity throughout. Like I said before, this movie begins with a bang, but it keeps up, like no kidding, with some of the violence that is shown off in this movie. It's quite brutal and gratuitous, and even had some of my audience gasping in some moments, especially with the second third of the movie rearing itself, and me not necessarily knowing what to expect as it progressed, because this movie already had a lot of unpredictable nature with it. Like like the first film too for the umpteenth time, this movie is more of a slower burning thriller with some action put in between, which I didn't mind, as running at a little over 2 hours, I was mostly engaged with what the movie was going for. When the movie does come to its third act, it does venture into some ridiculous territory, if you will. Some would consider it that, as I feel it does require some suspension of disbelief to get into what has occurred with what the movie is trying to do. It also adds on to one other issue I had with the screenplay, in how, similar to the first film, if you recall from the first film, there was a subplot where a Mexican police officer was integrated into the main story and culminating his subplot with the tunnel sequence from the first film, which was so exhilarating. This sequel tries something similar in having a teenage Mexican-American boy smuggling migrants. In that regard, this movie kind of has some beats of El Norte with it. And by the way, if you haven't seen this masterpiece of a drama, I give it my highest recommendation possible. It's a required viewing. Yet, what also does occur in me having issue with this subplot is that it could have been cut down significantly to actually make the movie a bit tighter, despite me mostly being engaged with the story. Though you cannot entirely remove this subplot, as it does culminate with the main part. But at the same time, for the open-endedness that this movie does have, along with the ambiguity that these characters have morally, there's really no defined good guy or bad guy here, a lot of shades of gray. It does leave me intrigued for where this franchise could possibly go next. All in all, this movie surprised me quite a bit for what it was able to do on its own and in attempting to follow up the first Sicario film. Though it goes without saying that I feel this is not as strong of a movie as that first Sicario film. Yet at the same time, I so admired what this sequel tried to do. It may also sound like that I've given this movie a lot of flack in paling in comparison to the original, when if you want to look at this movie on its own, it's a more than competently well-made film on its own merits. So in that regard, if you haven't seen the first Sicario film, which I highly recommend you do anyway to get more into the story, you will find some enjoyment here in some of the action scenes and how well shot they are, the performances being stupendous. In short, I think this is a worthy sequel and leaves itself open to some more ideas that could happen in the future for this now new franchise. I recommend it. My final verdict for Sicario, Day of the Soldado, is 3.5 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of Sicario, Day of the Soldado. Social media links in the description. Subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.